Sometimes the hardest thing in the world is watching your children go to bed hungry and knowing tomorrow won't be any different. For Sadi Mercer, hiding behind the blacksmith's barn in Hollow Trace with her 3 little ones, that nightmare had become her daily reality. The empty biscuit tin in her hands tells a story no mother should have to live. 8 months since her husband died, and the landlord's patience died with him. Now she's got nowhere left to turn, and winter coming fast. That's when she hears wagon wheels and boots hitting the ground. Through the barn boards, she sees Gideon Thorne, richest rancher in 3 counties, and a man who keeps to himself. He looks right at her hiding spot and says 4 words that change everything. "Get in my wagon now." Most folks in town know Gideon as hard and unforgiving. But what happens when the most powerful man in Hollow Trace finds the most powerless woman? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sadi's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at Gideon Thorne through the weathered slats of Murphy's barn. The man stood there like he owned the very air around him, which, truth be told, he practically did. His broad shoulders filled out a worn leather coat that had seen better decades, and his steel-grey hair caught what little afternoon light filtered through the October clouds. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. They weren't the cold, calculating eyes she'd expected from the stories folks told. They held something else entirely, a recognition that made her feel exposed and understood all at once. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed but tempered with something gentler. "Your children are shivering." Tommy pressed closer to her side, his 8-year-old frame trying to shield his baby brother Samuel, while little Lucy buried her face in Sadi's worn skirts. The boy had grown too thin these past months, his shoulder blades sharp beneath his patched shirt. Lucy's once bright curls hung limp and dull, and baby Samuel, sweet Samuel, who should be toddling and laughing, sat listless in her arms, too weak even to cry properly anymore. Sadi's throat closed around the words she wanted to say. What could she tell him? That she'd been a respectable woman once, married to a good man who worked the silver mines until a cave-in took him and 3 others. That she'd tried to make it on her own, taking in washing and mending until her fingers bled, but it wasn't enough to keep up with the rent. That last week she'd sold her wedding ring, her last precious thing, just to buy milk for Samuel. "I know who you are," Gideon continued, stepping closer to the barn. His boots made soft sounds on the packed earth, deliberate and unhurried. "You're Daniel Mercer's widow. He was a good man." The mention of her husband's name nearly undid her. Daniel had been a good man, kind and hard-working, with dreams of building them a proper house once he saved enough from the mines. He'd never lived to see his youngest son take his first steps or hear Lucy recite her letters. He'd never know that his wife would end up hiding behind buildings like some common vagrant. "Mr. Thorne," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm not looking for charity. We're just waiting for something that isn't coming," he finished. His tone held no judgment, just the flat certainty of a man who'd seen enough of the world to know how it worked. "Winter's coming early this year. You can smell it in the air." He was right. The bite in the wind carried the promise of frost, and frost meant the end of any hope she'd harbored of finding work before the deep cold set in. No one hired help when they were battening down for winter themselves. Gideon moved closer still, and she could see the lines around his eyes, not just from squinting into the sun, but from something deeper. Loss, maybe. Pain that had settled in and made itself at home. The townspeople spoke of him in hushed tones, called him the richest man in 3 counties, but also the loneliest. His wife had died young, they said, along with the child she carried. That was 3 years ago, and he'd been like a ghost ever since, running his vast ranch with ruthless efficiency, but keeping himself apart from the world. "My wagon's comfortable enough," he said, glancing toward the street where a sturdy buckboard waited, pulled by 2 well-fed horses. "And my house has warm rooms and a kitchen that knows how to fill an empty belly." Sadi's pride warred with desperation, and desperation was winning, but something in her still resisted. She'd heard the stories about powerful men who helped women in need, stories that didn't end well for the women. "Sir, we couldn't impose." "You're not imposing." His voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. "You're accepting help from a neighbor. That's what decent folks do." Tommy looked up at her with those two serious eyes that had seen more hardship than any child should. He didn't speak, hadn't said much since his father died, but she could read the plea in his expression. Lucy had begun to sway on her feet, exhaustion finally overtaking the fear that had kept her upright. And Samuel needed warmth and food and safety more than his mother needed her pride. "Why?" The word slipped out before she could stop it. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to some point beyond her shoulder. When he spoke again, his voice was rough around the edges. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything that matters, and because my house has been too quiet for too long." The honesty in that admission raw and unguarded made something shift inside her chest. This wasn't pity, she realized. This was recognition, one wounded soul reaching out to another. She looked down at her children, at their thin faces and hollow eyes, and felt her resistance crumble. "Just for tonight," she whispered. "Just for tonight," he agreed, though something in his tone suggested he didn't quite believe it either. The wagon ride through Hollow Trace's main street felt like a parade of shame and wonder combined. Faces appeared in windows and doorways as word spread faster than wildfire. Gideon Thorne, the untouchable widower, had taken in the Mercer woman and her children. Sadie kept her eyes fixed on her hands, folded tight in her lap, while the children stared wide-eyed at the world passing by from their perch on actual cushioned seats. Mrs. Henderson, from the general store, stood on her porch with her mouth hanging open. The banker, Cornelius Blake, stepped out of his establishment with a frown that could have soured milk. But Gideon paid them no mind, his attention focused on the road ahead as if he was simply running an errand instead of upending the social order of their small town. The Thorne Ranch sprawled across the valley like something from a storybook. Rolling pastures dotted with cattle stretched as far as the eye could see, bounded by split-rail fences that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. The house itself was a testament to successful stories of solid timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and windows that gleamed like welcoming eyes in the afternoon light. Sadie had never been this close to such grandeur. She'd glimpsed it from a distance when Daniel had worked on some of Gideon's fence repairs, but seeing it up close made her acutely aware of the patches on her dress and the worn soles of her shoes. "Maria," Gideon called as he helped them down from the wagon. A woman emerged from the house, middle-aged and sturdy, with kind eyes and flour dusting her apron. "We have guests. They'll be staying in the blue room." If Maria was surprised by this announcement, she hid it well. Her gaze took in Sadie and the children with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen her share of need, and her expression softened. "Of course, Signor. I'll prepare something warm for the little ones." The inside of the house was even more impressive than the outside, polished wood floors covered with colorful rugs, furniture that looked both comfortable and expensive, and windows that let in floods of golden light. But it was the warmth that struck Sadie most forcefully. Not just the heat from the massive stone fireplace, but something deeper. Despite its grandeur, this place felt like a home. Gideon led them up a curved staircase to a room that was larger than the entire cabin Sadie had shared with Daniel. A four-poster bed dominated the space, covered with quilts that looked handmade and well-loved. A smaller bed had been placed near the window, perfect for the children, and a cradle sat ready for Samuel. "Maria keeps this room ready," Gideon said, though he didn't explain why. "There's a wash basin behind that screen, and she'll bring up hot water shortly. Supper's at 6, just follow the stairs down and toward the back of the house." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Mrs. Mercer?" "Yes, sir?" "It's Sadie, isn't it?" When she nodded, he continued. "Sadie, then, and I'm Gideon. We don't stand much on ceremony here." After he left, Sadie sank into a chair beside the window and let the tears come. They weren't tears of sadness exactly, but something more complex relief and gratitude, and a bone-deep exhaustion that came from months of carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. Tommy approached cautiously and leaned against her knee. "Mama, are we safe now?" She smoothed his dark hair, Daniel's hair, and tried to find words that wouldn't be a lie. "For tonight, sweetheart. Tonight we're safe." But as she looked around the beautiful room, with its promise of warmth and comfort, she wondered if one night would be enough to remember what safety felt like. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, treacherous hope began to whisper that maybe, just maybe, Gideon Thorne's house might offer more than shelter from the storm. Down the hall, in his own room, Gideon stood at his window watching the sun set over his land. For the first time in 3 years, his house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt alive again, full of possibility and the sound of children's voices. He pulled open the top drawer of his desk and looked down at the small velvet box, nestled among his papers. Inside lay his late wife's wedding ring, a simple band of gold that he'd been unable to bury with her. He'd kept it close, a talisman of pain and love and loss. But tonight, for the first time since Catherine's death, he closed the drawer without taking the ring out. Tonight, the future seemed less like an enemy to be endured and more like a gift waiting to be unwrapped. In the kitchen below, Maria hummed an old lullaby as she prepared a meal fit for hungry children. The house that had been silent for so long was beginning to remember how to sing. The first night at the Thorne Ranch, Sadie barely slept. Every creak of the house, every distant sound from the cattle, every whisper of wind through the eaves reminded her that she was somewhere she didn't belong. The bed was too soft, the room too warm, the silence too complete after months of sleeping in places where danger lurked around every corner. She lay listening to her children's peaceful breathing, Tommy's steady rhythm from the smaller bed, Lucy's soft sighs, and Samuel's contented gurgling from the cradle. They had fallen asleep easily for the first time in weeks, bellies full from Maria's hearty stew, and bodies warm beneath clean quilts. The transformation had been immediate, and heartbreaking reminded her of how resilient children could be when given even the smallest taste of security. When dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Sadie rose quietly and began to gather their few belongings. She'd made her decision during the long, sleepless hours. One night of kindness was a gift beyond measure, but she couldn't impose further on Gideon's generosity. They would thank him properly and be on their way before he had cause to regret his impulsive act of mercy. Her hands stilled as she reached for the small bundle that contained Daniel's work, boots, the only thing of his she'd managed to keep through all their troubles. The leather was worn smooth from years of hard labor, the laces frayed but still strong. She'd carried them from place to place like a talisman, unable to part with this last tangible piece of her husband. Now, in the golden morning light streaming through windows she'd never be able to afford, they seemed like an anchor to a past that no longer existed. A soft knock interrupted her melancholy. "Mrs. Mercer? Sadie?" Gideon's voice carried through the door, gentle but concerned. "Maria's got breakfast waiting, and the children are awake." She tucked Daniel's boots back into the bundle and smoothed her hair as best she could. When she opened the door, Gideon stood in the hallway holding Samuel, who was clean and dressed in clothes that actually fit him properly. The sight of the stern rancher, cradling her baby with obvious care, made something twist painfully in her chest. "He was fussing a bit," Gideon explained, his voice unusually soft. "Maria thought he might be hungry." "Thank you," Sadie managed, reaching for her son. But Samuel seemed content where he was, his tiny hand fisted in Gideon's shirt front, his dark eyes bright and alert in a way they hadn't been for weeks. Downstairs, the kitchen bustled with warmth and activity. Maria had prepared a feast that would have fed them for days in their former life, eggs and bacon, fresh biscuits with honey, milk so rich it left white moustaches on the children's faces. Tommy and Lucy ate with the focused intensity of children who remembered hunger, while Gideon watched them with an expression that spoke of old pain and new wonder combined. "Slow down, my Joss," Maria said gently, ruffling Lucy's curls. "There's plenty more where that came from." Lucy looked up with eyes wide as saucers. "Really? We can have more?" The simple question hung in the air like a revelation of just how far they'd fallen. Sadie felt heat rise in her cheeks, shame warring with gratitude. These were her children, and they'd been reduced to marveling at the concept of seconds at breakfast. Gideon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "As much as you want, little one, always." After breakfast, while the children explored the ranch yard under Maria's watchful eye, Sadie approached Gideon, where he stood on the porch, reviewing ledgers with his foreman, a weathered man named Jack Morrison. "Mr. Thorne, Gideon," she corrected herself when he raised an eyebrow. "I can't thank you enough for your kindness last night." The children slept better than they have in months, and the meal was more generous than anything we had a right to expect. Something in her tone must have warned him of what was coming. He set down his papers and gave her his full attention, those grey eyes reading her face with uncomfortable accuracy. "But," he said simply, "but we can't impose any further. You've done more than enough, and it's time we moved on." Jack Morrison had developed a sudden fascination with his bootlaces. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to where Tommy was helping one of the ranch hands mend a fence, his small hands earnest as he held boards in place. "Where will you go?" Gideon asked finally. The question she'd been dreading. "There are opportunities in Denver," she said, trying to inject conviction into her voice. "More people, more work to be found." "Winter work? For a woman with 3 young children and no connections?" The blunt assessment hit home because it was true. She had no plan beyond getting as far from Hollow Trace as possible before her courage failed, and she found herself accepting more charity than her pride could bear. "I'll manage," she said, lifting her chin. "I always have." "Have you?" His voice was gentle but relentless. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like managing meant hiding behind barns and watching your children grow thin." The words stung because they were accurate, but they also sparked her temper. "I did my best with what I had. Not everyone can solve problems by throwing money at them." Instead of taking offense, Gideon smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. "There's the fire I was wondering about. Daniel always said you had spirit enough for 2 people. The mention of her husband caught her off guard. "You knew Daniel well." "Well enough. He worked on my fences a few summers back, and he talked about you and the children constantly. Proud as a peacock, that man was, especially of his wife's backbone." Sadie felt tears threaten again. Daniel had been proud of her, she'd known that. But hearing it from someone else, someone who had no reason to lie, made the loss feel fresh all over again. "He also worried," Gideon continued, "worried about what would happen to his family if something happened to him. The mines are dangerous work, and Daniel wasn't fool enough to pretend otherwise." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe accepting help isn't about charity or pride. Maybe it's about honoring the wishes of a good man who wanted his family taken care of." Before Sadie could respond, a commotion in the yard drew their attention. Tommy had wandered too close to one of the horse-spirited mare that didn't take kindly to sudden movements. The horse reared, hooves flashing dangerously close to the boy's head. Gideon moved faster than seemed possible for a man his size, vaulting the porch rail and reaching Tommy in 3 long strides. He swept the boy out of harm's way, just as the mare's hooves crashed down where he'd been standing. "Easy, girl," Gideon murmured to the horse, his voice calm and authoritative. The mare settled immediately, recognizing the voice of her master. "Tommy, you all right?" The boy nodded, shaken but unhurt. "I'm sorry, Mr. Gideon. I just wanted to pet her." "No harm done. But Duchess here needs to trust you before she'll let you close. Trust takes time." The words seemed directed at more than just the boy. Gideon's eyes found Sadie's across the yard, and she felt the weight of meaning behind them. That evening, after another meal that left the children drowsy with contentment, Sadie found herself alone with Gideon in the parlor. The children were upstairs with Maria, who had somehow produced a collection of toys and picture books that kept them enchanted. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sadie began carefully. About Daniel's wishes. Gideon waited, patient as stone. And I'm only saying if we were to stay a bit longer, it would have to be on my terms. I won't be a kept woman or a burden on your household. What terms? I earn my keep. Cooking, cleaning, mending whatever needs doing. And the children help where they can. Tommy's a good worker, and Lucy's learning her letters. And in return, room and board until spring. When the weather breaks and work opens up again, we'll be on our way. Gideon considered this, his expression unreadable. What about schooling for the children? I can teach them what they need to know. Tommy needs to be around other boys his age. And Lucy should be learning from someone who finished more than 8 grades. The criticism stung, partly because it was fair. I did the best I could with the education I had. I know you did. I'm not criticizing, I'm offering solutions. There's a good school in town, and the teacher, Miss Adelaide, is a friend. The children could start after Thanksgiving. The offer was generous, almost suspiciously so. Why are you doing this? Really? Gideon was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire that crackled in the massive stone hearth. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. He was trying to hide. 3 years ago, my wife Catherine died, giving birth to our son. He lived for 2 days. He paused, swallowing hard. This house has been a mausoleum ever since. Your children, their laughter, their questions, even their chaos, they remind me that life doesn't have to stop because death comes calling. The raw honesty of the admission left Sadie speechless. She'd expected practical reasons, perhaps even ulterior motives. She hadn't expected this glimpse into a grief that matched her own. I'm not looking for a replacement family, Gideon continued. I'm not that naive. But having you here, all of you, makes this place feel like a home again instead of a tomb. Sadie studied his profile in the firelight, seeing the man beneath the reputation. Hollow Trace knew Gideon Thorne as wealthy and powerful, respected and feared in equal measure. But they didn't know about the way he'd moved, without hesitation, to protect Tommy, or how naturally he'd held Samuel, or the careful gentleness he showed when speaking to Lucy. Until spring, then, she said quietly. He turned to look at her, surprise flickering in his grey eyes. You'll stay? We'll stay, but I meant what I said about earning our keep. Fair enough, though I should warn you, Maria's been running this household for 15 years. She might not appreciate interference in her kitchen. Then I'll have to convince her I'm worth the trouble. For the second time that day, Gideon smiled. This time, Sadie found herself smiling back. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, covering the ranch in a blanket of white that sparkled like diamonds in the lamplight. Winter was coming to Hollow Trace, but for the first time in months, Sadie wasn't afraid of the cold. The routine that developed over the following weeks felt as natural as breathing, though it surprised everyone involved. Sadie rose before dawn to help Maria prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, her movements in the kitchen efficient and sure, despite her unfamiliarity with the massive wood-burning stove and well-stocked pantry. Maria had been skeptical at first, protective of her domain after years of running the household without interference, but Sadie's genuine desire to help, rather than take over, gradually won the older woman's approval. You have good hands? Maria observed one morning as she watched Sadie knead bread dough with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd been making do with little for far too long. And you don't waste anything. It was high praise from a woman who'd learned her own frugality during lean years on her family's farm in Mexico. The two women began to work in companionable silence, sharing the kitchen duties with an efficiency born of mutual respect. Gideon, meanwhile, found himself adapting his schedule in ways that would have amused his ranch hands if they'd been brave enough to comment. The man who had once taken his meals in solitary silence now lingered at the breakfast table, drawn by Tommy's eager questions about ranch operations and Lucy's chattered observations about everything from the patterns Frost made on windows to the way the barn cats seemed to know when it was going to snow. "Mr. Gideon," Tommy asked one morning, his serious 8-year-old face intent over his plate of eggs, How do you know which cattle are yours when they're all mixed up together? Gideon set down his coffee cup, giving the question the consideration it deserved. Each ranch has its own brander mark burned into the hide so everyone knows who owns what. Would you like to see how it's done? The boy's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that reminded Gideon powerfully of his own childhood fascination with ranch work. Could I? Really? After you finish your schoolwork with your mother? And if she agrees? Sadie felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite name at the careful way Gideon deferred to her authority as the children's parent. Too many men in her experience assumed that their opinions carried more weight simply by virtue of being men. But Gideon consistently asked her permission before including the children in ranch activities, respecting boundaries she hadn't even realized she'd drawn. The mornings passed quickly, filled with lessons that Sadie conducted at the kitchen table while Maria worked around them. Tommy proved to have his father's quick mind for numbers, while Lucy showed an artistic bent that surprised everyone. Samuel, now thriving on regular meals and warmth, had begun to crawl with determination that often led him into predicaments that required rescue. Afternoons brought different rhythms. While Sadie helped with mending and household tasks, the children were gradually introduced to ranch life under Gideon's patient supervision. Tommy proved fearless around the horses, though he'd learned to approach them with the respect Duchess had demanded. Lucy preferred the chickens and barn cats, content to collect eggs and pet anything that would hold still long enough. It was during one of these afternoon sessions that Gideon surprised them all. Tommy had been helping repair a section of fence, his small hands steady as he held boards in place while Gideon hammered. When they finished, Gideon disappeared into the barn and returned with something tucked under his arm. "Been working on this in the evenings," he said gruffly, handing Tommy a carefully carved wooden horse. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Every detail, from the flowing mane to the delicate hooves, showed hours of patient work. Tommy accepted the gift with the reverence it deserved, his fingers tracing the smooth wood with wonder. "You made this? For me? Figured you needed something of your own around here," Gideon replied, his attempt at casual indifference fooling no one. Every boy should have a good horse, even if it's just a wooden one. Sadie watched from the porch where she'd been hanging laundry, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. The scene before her, the tall, weathered rancher and the earnest boy, looked like something from a family portrait. It was beautiful and heartbreaking all at once, because she knew it couldn't last. That evening, after the children were asleep, she found Gideon in his study going over account books. The room smelled of leather and tobacco, masculine and comfortable in a way that spoke of long evenings spent in solitary contemplation. "Thank you," she said simply, "for the horse. Tommy hasn't put it down since you gave it to him." Gideon looked up from his ledgers, lamplight casting shadows across his angular features. "He's a good boy. Reminds me of myself at that age, always wanting to help, to prove he's useful." His father was the same way. Daniel never could sit still when there was work to be done. They fell into comfortable silence, the only sounds the scratch of Gideon's pen and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. Sadie found herself studying his hands as he worked, strong and capable, marked by years of honest labor despite his wealth. There was something soothing about watching those hands move across the page, recording the day's business with meticulous care. "Can I ask you something?" she ventured finally. "Of course. What did you do before you lost your wife? You seem to know instinctively what children need, but you said you never had the chance to be a father." Gideon's pen stilled. For a moment she thought she'd overstepped, ventured into territory too personal for their still tentative relationship. But then he set the pen aside and leaned back in his chair. "I was the eldest of 4 boys," he said. "My mother died when I was 12, and my father, well, he wasn't much good with children even when he tried. I raised my brothers more than he did." The revelation explained much the easy way he interacted with Tommy, his instinctive understanding of what the children needed, the patient manner that suggested long experience with young minds. "Where are they now? Your brothers?" "Scattered to the winds. James went east to study law. Michael joined the army, and Samuel, His voice caught slightly. Samuel died in a riding accident when he was 16. Another loss, another grief carried in silence. Sadie began to understand the shadows that lived behind Gideon's grey eyes, the careful way he held himself apart from emotional entanglements. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "It was a long time ago. But yes, I know children. I know they need consistency and kindness and someone who believes they're worth the effort. Your children have that in you, but they need more. They need to know they belong somewhere." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to address. The arrangement they'd made was temporary, a convenience that served them both until spring came and better options presented themselves. But already, Sadie could see the way the children were putting down roots, the way they spoke of the ranch as home and referred to Gideon with the easy familiarity of family. "They're getting attached," she said, voicing the fear that had been growing in her heart. Would that be such a terrible thing? The question was quietly asked, but it carried the weight of possibility. Sadie felt her carefully constructed walls begin to tremble. She told herself this was temporary, that she could accept Gideon's help without losing her independence or compromising her children's future. But watching Tommy treasure his wooden horse, seeing Lucy's confidence bloom under Gideon's patient attention, feeling Samuel's delight when the stern rancher smiled at him, it was becoming harder to imagine leaving this place that had begun to feel like sanctuary. "I don't know," she admitted. "I suppose it depends on what happens when spring comes." Gideon studied her face in the lamplight, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could read thoughts she hadn't even fully formed herself. "Spring's still months away," he said finally. "A lot can change in that time." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that sparkled under the stars. The winter that had once seemed like an enemy to be survived now felt like a gift time to heal, to grow, to discover what might be possible when broken. People found shelter in each other's kindness. That night, Sadie lay listening to her children's peaceful breathing and allowed herself to dream just for a moment of what it might be like to stay. Not as charity cases or temporary guests, but as family. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Down the hall, Gideon sat by his window, watching the snow fall and thinking about wooden horses and the sound of children's laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent too long. In his desk drawer, his wife's wedding ring lay forgotten as he contemplated a future that looked nothing like the past he'd been clinging to. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new moments of connection and doubt, but tonight the Thorne Ranch felt like what it had always been meant to be: home. November arrived with a vengeance, bringing storms that rattled the windows and reminded everyone why frontier winters were not to be taken lightly. But inside the Thorne house, warmth reigned supramenant just from the massive fireplaces that Maria kept burning day and night, but from the sense of belonging that had settled over the household like a favorite quilt. Sadie had found her rhythm in ways that surprised her. The kitchen, which had once seemed impossibly grand, now felt like her domain. She worked alongside Maria to prepare hearty meals for the ranch hands, her movements confident as she kneaded bread and stirred stews that filled the house with savory aromas. More importantly, she'd begun to add her own touches, recipes passed down from her mother, techniques learned during the lean years when every ingredient had to count. It was while searching through her meager belongings for her thimble that she rediscovered her mother's recipe book. The small, leather-bound volume was water-damaged and worn, its pages yellow with age and stained from years of use. Many of the recipes were barely legible, the ink faded and the paper soft as cloth. But as Sadie turned the familiar pages, memories flooded back her mother's patient hands guiding hers as she learned to measure flour by feel, the way the kitchen smelled when apple pies were cooling on the windowsill. The comfort of traditions passed from woman to woman through generations. "What have you found there?" Maria asked, noticing Sadie's absorption in the little book. "My mother's recipes," Sadie replied, her voice soft with remembrance. "I thought I'd lost it when we had to leave our place, but it was tucked inside Daniel's coat pocket." Maria approached with the reverence such treasures deserved. She understood the value of family recipes, the way they carried not just ingredients and instructions, but love and memory. "May I see?" Together, they bent over the fragile pages, deciphering faded handwriting and discussing adaptations for the ranch's well-equipped kitchen. Some recipes called for ingredients they didn't have, but Maria's years of experience helped them find substitutions that honored the spirit, if not the letter, of the original instructions. "This one," Maria said, pointing to a recipe for molasses cookies. "This would be perfect for the children. And here this stew recipe. We could make it for the hands during the next storm." The collaboration felt natural, two women bridging cultures and circumstances through the universal language of cooking. Sadie found herself sharing stories of her Mothra, gentle woman who died too young, leaving behind recipes and wisdom that had sustained her daughter through the hardest years of her life. Meanwhile, the children were thriving in ways that made Sadie's heart sing, even as it worried her. Tommy had thrown himself into ranch life with the enthusiasm of a boy who'd finally found his place in the world. He followed the ranch hands around, eager to learn everything from how to properly saddle a horse to the best way to mend a broken fence rail. His small frame was filling out thanks to regular meals, and his serious demeanor was lightening as he rediscovered the simple joy of being a child. Lucy, too, was blossoming. The shy, frightened little girl who'd hidden behind Sadie's skirts was emerging as a bright, curious child with opinions about everything. She'd appointed herself supervisor of the chickens, checking on them multiple times a day, and somehow managing to increase their egg production through sheer force of will and an endless supply of treats smuggled from the kitchen. And Samuel, sweet Samuel, who'd been so listless during their darkest days, was now a whirlwind of toddler energy. He'd taken his first steps in the ranch house parlor, lurching from sofa to chair while Gideon and Sadie watched with matching expressions of pride and amazement. His vocabulary was expanding daily, though his favorite word remained Giddy, his attempt at Gideon's name that never failed to bring a smile to the rancher's weathered face. It was Samuel's growing attachment to Gideon that worried Sadie most. The baby had begun following the rancher around whenever possible, his small hand clutching Gideon's larger one as they made their rounds of the property. He cried when Gideon left for business trips to Denver or Cheyenne, and his face lit up like sunrise whenever the man returned. The attachment was clearly mutual. Gideon had taken to carrying Samuel during the evening rounds, pointing out cattle and horses while conducting serious conversations with the toddler about ranch management. He'd also begun reading bedtime stories, something Sadie discovered by accident when she went to check on the children one evening and heard his deep voice coming from their room, carefully pronouncing the words of a fairy tale. "He's good with them," Jack Morrison observed one afternoon as they watched Gideon teaching Tommy how to properly throw a lasso. The foreman had become a regular presence at the main house, often staying for dinner and clearly enjoying the family atmosphere that had replaced Gideon's former isolation. "Too good," Sadie replied, her voice heavy with concern she couldn't quite hide. Jack glanced at her with understanding eyes. He'd worked for Gideon for over a decade, had seen the man retreat into himself after Catherine's death. But he'd also seen the transformation that had taken place since Sadie and her children arrived, the way Gideon's step had lightened, how he smiled more readily. The interest he'd regained in plans for the ranch's future. "Might not be such a bad thing," Jack suggested carefully. "Man needs family, and those children, well, they need a father." "They had a father," Sadie said, perhaps more sharply than she intended. "Daniel was a good man." "I'm sure he was, but he's gone. And life's for the living. Gideon's not trying to replace anyone, he's just filling a space that's been empty too long." The conversation stayed with Sadie as she went about her daily tasks. Was she being unfair to cling so tightly to Daniel's memory? Was her determination to maintain their independence actually hurting her children? The questions plagued her, especially during the quiet moments when she allowed herself to really observe the family dynamics that were developing. There was no denying that her children were happier than they'd been since Daniel's death. Tommy's nightmares had stopped, Lucy's appetite had returned, and Samuel was reaching developmental milestones that had been delayed by stress and malnutrition. More telling still was the way they interacted with Gideon, with the careful politeness of children, mindful of their precarious position, but with the easy affection of children who felt secure in their place. The transformation was evident in small moments. Tommy automatically setting a place for Gideon at breakfast, Lucy insisting that Gideon admire every egg she collected, Samuel falling asleep against the rancher's shoulder during evening story time. They were building a relationship that went beyond gratitude or charity. They were becoming a family. The realization hit Sadie with unexpected force one snowy evening in late November. She'd been looking for Samuel, who had a toddler's gift for disappearing at the most inconvenient moments. She found him in Gideon's study, sitting on the floor surrounded by ledger books while Gideon worked at his desk. The baby was reading aloud in his incomprehensible toddler language, turning pages with great seriousness while Gideon nodded and offered encouraging comments. "Very insightful point about the cattle prices," Gideon was saying with complete gravity. "I hadn't considered that angle." Samuel babbled something else and pointed at a column of numbers, his expression earnest. "You're absolutely right," Gideon agreed. "We should definitely factor that into our spring planning." The scene was so domestic, so natural, that for a moment Sadie forgot they were temporary guests in this house. For a moment, she allowed herself to see what Jack had suggested, not a replacement for Daniel, but a man willing to step into the role of father, because children needed fathers, and he needed children. That night, after the little ones were asleep, she found herself alone with Gideon in the parlor again. He was reading by the fire while she worked on mending one of Tommy's shirts, a domestic scene that would have looked perfectly natural to any observer. "Gideon," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice the thoughts that had been troubling her. He looked up from his book, patient and attentive. "What is it?" "The children, they're getting very attached to you, to this place. And that worries you." It wasn't a question, and his understanding made it easier to continue. "When spring comes and we leave, it's going to be hard for them, especially Samuel. He doesn't remember life before this ranch." Gideon closed his book and gave her his full attention. "What if you didn't leave?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that this arrangement is working for all of us. The children are thriving. You've brought life back to this house, and He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I haven't been this happy in years." Sadie's heart hammered against her ribs. "Are you proposing?" "I'm suggesting we consider making this permanent. Marriage would give you security, give the children stability, and it would solve the problem of tongues wagging in town about our living arrangements." The practical way he presented it stung, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps because part of her had begun to hope for something more than convenience, something that acknowledged the feelings that had been growing between them during these weeks of shared domesticity. "A marriage of convenience," she said carefully. "A marriage of mutual benefit," he corrected. "We both care about the children's welfare. We work well together, and there's no denying the attraction between us." Heat rose in her cheeks at his frank acknowledgement of what they'd both been trying to ignore. There was attraction had been since that first day when he'd found them behind the barn. But attraction wasn't love, and she'd had love once. Was it fair to settle for less? "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course, there's no rush. Winter isn't going anywhere, and neither are we." But even as he agreed to give her time, Sadie could see the hope in his eyes, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. He wanted them more than his practical words had suggested. The knowledge was both comforting and concerning, because if Gideon was developing feelings beyond mere convenience, then leaving in the spring would hurt him too. Outside, the wind howled around the house, driving snow against the windows with increasing fury. The storm that had been building all day was settling in for a long siege, the kind of blizzard that could last for days and leave them completely cut off from the outside world. But inside the warm parlor, With the fire crackling and the comfortable silence of two people learning to read each other's thoughts, the storm felt less like a threat and more like a blessing. Time, that was what they all needed. Time to let feelings develop naturally. Time for the children to adjust to their new reality. Time for Sadie to figure out what her heart truly wanted. The recipe book lay open on the table beside her, mending, its pages filled with wisdom passed down through generations of women who'd learned to make homes wherever love took root. Perhaps that was the real recipe she needed, not ingredients and instructions, but the courage to trust that sometimes the best families were the ones you chose, not the ones you were born into. December brought with it a crystalline beauty that transformed the ranch into something from a winter fairy tale. The snow lay thick and pristine across the pastures, broken only by the dark lines of fence posts and the careful paths the ranch hands maintained between the house, barn, and bunkhouse. The cattle huddled together in the shelter Gideon had built for them, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air as they waited out the season's harshest months. Inside the house, Christmas preparations began in earnest. Maria threw herself into the task with infectious enthusiasm, enlisting Sadie and the children in projects that filled the house with the scents of cinnamon and pine. Lucy proved particularly gifted at decorating, her small hands creating intricate patterns with ribbons and holly that exceeded anything Sadie could have imagined. It was during one of these crafting sessions that Gideon shared more of his family's history. He'd been helping Tommy construct a wooden nativity scene, his large hands guiding the boys' smaller ones as they carefully shaped wise men from scraps of pine. "My father started that tradition," Gideon said, nodding toward an elaborate nativity scene that occupied place of honor on the mantelpiece. Every Christmas, he'd add a new piece. Took him nearly 20 years to complete the whole set. Sadie looked up from where she was helping Lucy string cranberries for garland. "It's beautiful. The detail work is extraordinary." He was a craftsman when he wasn't ranching, made most of the furniture in this house, actually. Gideon's voice carried pride and old sadness combined. Always said his hands were only as good as his heart. Tommy looked up from his carving, his young face serious. Was he a good papa? The question hung in the air, innocent but loaded with meaning. Gideon was quiet for a moment, his knife stilling as he considered his answer. "He tried to be," Gideon said finally, "but he was better with wood than with words. After my mother died, he didn't know how to talk to us boys. So he'd make things instead: toys, furniture, little treasures he'd leave on our beds when we were feeling low." Sadie felt her heart clench at the image of a grieving man trying to express love through the work of his hands. It reminded her painfully of Daniel, who had also struggled to find words for his deepest feelings, but could build anything she needed. "Is that why you made me the horse?" Tommy asked with the directness that only children could manage. Gideon smiled, and Sadie saw something shift in his expressiona, recognition perhaps, of patterns repeating across generations. "Maybe it is. Maybe some lessons get passed down whether we mean them to or not." From his vest pocket, Gideon pulled out a gleaming pocket watch, its gold surface worn smooth by generations of handling. He opened it carefully, revealing an intricate mechanism that caught the firelight and threw tiny rainbows across the walls. "This was his too," Gideon said, holding it where Tommy could see, "and his father's before him, been in the Thorne family for near 60 years. The watch was beautiful, but more than that, it was clearly precious, the kind of heirloom that represented continuity, legacy, the hope that something of value would survive even when the people who created it were gone. "Will you give it to your son someday?" Lucy asked, abandoning her cranberries to peer at the treasure. The question hit differently than Tommy's had. Sadie saw Gideon's hand tighten imperceptibly around the watch, saw the flash of old pain cross his features. For 3 years, he'd assumed he would die without an heir, that the Thorne legacy would end with him. "I don't have a son," he said quietly. "But you could," Lucy said with the matter-of-fact confidence of a 5-year-old. "If you married Mama, then Tommy would be your son, and me and Samuel would be your children too." The child's innocent words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that touched everyone present. Sadie felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized her children had been discussing possibilities she'd barely begun to acknowledge herself. "Lucy," she said gently, "that's not something we should assume." "But it's true, isn't it?" Tommy interrupted, his serious eyes moving between his mother and Gideon. "I heard Jack say that Mr. Gideon needs a family and we need a papa, and you like each other, I can tell." Out of the mouths of babes, Sadie found herself looking at Gideon, seeing her own confusion and hope reflected in his grey eyes. The children had cut through all the careful politeness and adult complications to identify the simple truth: they were already functioning as a family in all the ways that mattered. "Children," Sadie began, but Gideon held up a hand. "They're not wrong," he said quietly, "about any of it." He closed the pocket watch with a gentle click and returned it to his vest. Then he looked directly at Sadie, his gaze steady and serious. "I've been thinking about what we discussed about making this arrangement permanent, and I realize I didn't say it right before. This isn't just about convenience or solving practical problems." Sadie's breath caught as she waited for him to continue. "I care about you, Sadie, about all of you. Somewhere between that first night and now, you stopped being guests and started being family. The children are right. I do need a family, and they need a father. But more than that, I think we could be happy together, really happy." The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability he was showing in front of the children, moved her more than any flowery declaration could have. This was Gideon, as she'd come to know him, direct, sincere, willing to put his heart on the line when it mattered. Before she could respond, Samuel toddled over from where he'd been playing with wooden blocks. He climbed into Gideon's lap with the confidence of a child who'd never been refused, settled himself comfortably, and looked up at the man who'd become his whole world. "Giddy," he said clearly, then patted Gideon's chest over his heart. "Mine." The simple possessiveness of it broke something open in Sadie's chest. Samuel had been barely walking when Daniel died. He had no memory of his father, no understanding of what he'd lost. To him, Gideon wasn't a replacement or a substitute. He was simply Papa, the man who read him stories and carried him around the ranch and made faces that made him laugh until his sides hurt. "Yes, little man," Gideon said softly, his arms tightening around the toddler. "Yours." The word carried weight beyond simple agreement. It was a promise, a commitment, a recognition that real love wasn't about blood or law, but about choice and dedication and the daily decision to show up for the people who mattered. That evening, after the children were asleep, Sadie and Gideon found themselves in their usual spots in the parlor. But the comfortable routine felt different now, charged with possibilities that had been spoken aloud and could no longer be ignored. "I should tell you about Catherine," Gideon said without preamble. "If we're going to do this, if you're even considering it, you need to understand what happened." Sadie set down her mending and gave him her full attention. She'd heard fragments of the story from townspeople, but she sensed that Gideon had never told anyone the full truth. "We were childhood sweethearts," he began, his voice careful and controlled. "Married young, maybe too young. She was beautiful and kind and everything a man could want in a wife. But she was also fragile in ways I didn't understand until it was too late." He paused, staring into the fire, as if the flames might hold answers to questions that had haunted him for years. "She lost 3 babies before she managed to carry one far enough to hope. The doctor said the pregnancy was risky, that we should consider, but Catherine was determined. She said God wouldn't give us this chance just to take it away." Sadie's heart ached for both of them, for the woman who'd wanted motherhood so desperately, and for the man who'd had to watch her suffer through repeated losses. When her time came, it was hard. Harder than anyone expected. She labored for nearly 2 days before, his voice broke slightly, she delivered a perfect son. Beautiful boy with dark hair and her blue eyes. We named him Michael, after my brother. What happened? He lived for 2 days, never quite managed to breathe right, never seemed to settle. Catherine kept saying he just needed time, that he'd get stronger. And then one morning, he just stopped. The raw pain in his voice made Sadie want to reach out and comfort him, but she sensed he needed to finish this story his own way. Catherine died 3 hours later. The doctor said it was blood loss, complications from the birth. But I think she just couldn't bear to live in a world without him. Gideon's hands clenched into fists. I buried them together, her holding him like she was still trying to protect him. Silence settled over them, heavy with shared grief and understanding. Sadie knew that kind of loss, the way it carved pieces out of your soul that never quite healed, the way it made you afraid to hope for anything good, because hope had betrayed you so completely. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That's a terrible burden to carry. For 3 years, I thought that was it for me, that I'd had my chance at family and failed. This house felt like a mausoleum, beautiful but empty, full of ghosts and might-have-beens." He turned to look at her then, his grey eyes intense and searching. "But you changed that. You and the children you brought life back to this place, not as replacements for what I lost, but as something new, something I never expected to find." Sadie felt tears prick her eyes. The honesty of his confession, the way he'd trusted her with his deepest pain, moved her beyond words. "I love Daniel," she said quietly. "I need you to know that. What we had was real and precious, and I'll never regret it. I know, and I would never ask you to. But he's gone, and much as I hate to admit it, the children are right. They do need a father. And she paused, gathering courage. "I think I'm falling in love with you." The admission hung between them, honest and terrifying and liberating all at once. Gideon's face transformed, hope and wonder replacing the careful control he'd maintained throughout his confession. "Are you saying yes to making this permanent?" "I'm saying yes to trying, to seeing what we might build together." Gideon was across the room before she'd finished speaking, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. The kiss he gave her was gentle but thorough, full of promise and carefully leashed passion. "We'll do this right," he murmured against her lips. "Proper courtship, proper engagement, proper wedding. I want the whole town to know you chose to be here." Outside, snow continued to fall, adding to the drifts that would keep them isolated for weeks yet. But isolation no longer felt like imprisonment, it felt like sanctuary, time to let love grow in the shelter of winter's protection. The pocket watch ticked steadily in Gideon's vest, marking time that no longer felt like an enemy but like an ally, giving them all the moments they needed to build something lasting and true. The week between Christmas and New Year's brought an unexpected thaw that turned the ranch's pristine snow into treacherous slush and reminded everyone that Montana weather was as unpredictable as it was beautiful. The break in the winter's grip allowed for the first trip to town in nearly a month, and Gideon decided it was time to make their arrangement official in the eyes of both God and the territorial government. The ride to Hollow Trace was different this time. Instead of a desperate woman hiding behind a barn, Sadie sat beside Gideon on the wagon seat with her head held high, her children clean and well-fed in the back, their laughter ringing across the valley as they pointed out landmarks that had become familiar during their months at the ranch. But if Sadie felt confident in her decision, the town's reaction reminded her that not everyone would approve of their unconventional courtship. Heads turned as they passed down Main Street, and she could feel the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations following their progress. "Let them talk," Gideon said quietly, apparently reading her discomfort with the ease that had developed between them. "By spring, they'll have found something else to occupy their attention." Their first stop was the general store, where Mrs. Henderson's curiosity warred visibly with her desire to maintain proper social niceties. She greeted them with carefully neutral politeness, while her eyes took inventory of every detail: Sadie's new dress, one of several Maria had altered from Catherine's wardrobe, the children's obvious health and happiness, the way Gideon's hand rested protectively on Samuel's shoulder. "Mrs. Mercer," she said with studied formality, "how nice to see you again, and the children look well." "They are well, thank you," Sadie replied, matching the woman's tone. "Mr. Thorne has been very generous with his hospitality." It was a diplomatic way to phrase their living arrangements, but Sadie could see in Mrs. Henderson's expression that diplomacy wouldn't prevent gossip. The woman's gaze lingered meaningfully on the way, Tommy automatically moved to Gideon's side, the casual familiarity that spoke of months of shared daily life. Their second stop proved more challenging. Cornelius Blake's bank occupied the most impressive building on Main Street, its brick facade and brass fittings designed to project an aura of prosperity and respectability. Blake himself was a man who cultivated both qualities with religious devotion, and his reaction to their entrance was several degrees colder than the winter air outside. "Thorne," he said with minimal politeness, "Mrs. Mercer, I wasn't expecting to see you in town." "Business doesn't stop for weather," Gideon replied evenly. "I need to make some changes to my accounts and update my will." Blake's eyebrows rose at the mention of the will, and Sadi saw calculation flicker behind his pale eyes. The banker had always resented Gideon's independence, both financial and personal, and the idea that the wealthiest man in the county might be planning to share that wealth with a woman of uncertain background clearly rankled. "Significant changes?" Blake asked with studied casualness. "Significant enough," Gideon replied without elaborating. "I'll need new documents drawn up to reflect my upcoming marriage." The words fell into the bank's marble-lined silence like stones into a pond. Blake's face went through a series of expression surprise, calculation, and finally a sort of cold disapproval that made Sadi's spine stiffen. "Marriage," Blake repeated. "How sudden?" "Not sudden," Gideon corrected. "Deliberate. Mrs. Mercer has agreed to become my wife, and I intend to ensure she and her children are provided for accordingly. Of course, though I hope you'll forgive me for noting that such arrangements can sometimes attract opportunistic interest. A man in your position must be careful about those who might seek to take advantage of his generous nature." The insult was delicately delivered but unmistakable. Sadi felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Gideon stepped forward, his presence suddenly filling the space between them and Blake in a way that made the banker take an involuntary step backward. "Mr. Blake," Gideon said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made grown men think twice about crossing him. "I'm going to assume you misspoke just now, because if I thought you were suggesting that Mrs. Mercer was anything other than a woman of impeccable character who has brought nothing but good to my household, we'd have a problem." Blake's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Of course not. I merely meant—" "I know what you meant, and I'm telling you that your concerns are both unfounded and unwelcome. Now, do you want my business, or shall I take it to Denver?" The threat was quietly delivered but effective. Blake's bank depended heavily on Gideon's substantial accounts, and they both knew it. The banker's expression shifted quickly from hostility to damage control. "There's no need for that. I'll have the documents prepared immediately. When is the happy occasion?" "Soon," Gideon replied without specifics. "I'll send word when we've set a date." As they left the bank, Sadi felt a mixture of gratitude and concern. Gideon's defense of her honor had been both thrilling and thrilling because it showed the depth of his commitment, troubling because it revealed the challenges they would face as a couple. "He doesn't approve," she said quietly as they walked toward the church. "Blake doesn't approve of anything that doesn't directly benefit him. His opinion carries no weight with anyone who matters." But even as Gideon dismissed the banker's hostility, Sadi could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw remained tight as they made their way down the street. Blake's disapproval might not matter to Gideon personally, but it could have practical consequences, and they both knew it. The church provided a welcome respite from the town's mixed reception. Reverend Matthews was a kind man in his 60s who had officiated at both Gideon's first wedding and Daniel's funeral. He greeted them with genuine warmth and listened with obvious pleasure as Gideon explained their desire to marry. "I'll be honored to perform the ceremony," he said with a smile that included all of them. "Catherine would have wanted you to find happiness again, Gideon. And these children," he looked at Tommy, Lucy, and Samuel with the special fondness reserved for the young. "They'll benefit greatly from having a father like you." It was the first wholehearted approval they'd received, and Sadi felt some of her tension ease. Whatever challenges they might face in the broader community, they would have the church's blessing hand in a place like Hollow Trace that carried significant weight. That evening, Back at the ranch, Sadie found herself going through her few personal belongings once again. This time, though, she wasn't searching for necessities, but for memory specifically, the small daguerreotype of her wedding day that she'd hidden away months ago. The photograph was faded and cracked, but it clearly showed her and Daniel on the happiest day of their young lives. She was 18, he was 20, and they both radiated the confidence of people who believed love could conquer anything. Her dress had been simple but elegant, borrowed from her mother and altered to fit. Daniel wore his best suit, the one she'd later bury him in, and his expression was one of pride and joy and infinite possibility. Looking at it now, Sadie felt the familiar pang of loss, but also something newer, sense of completion rather than abandonment. She had loved Daniel completely, and he had loved her the same way. Nothing could change that, or diminish its value. But love wasn't a finite resource. The heart, she was learning, had an infinite capacity for expanding when given the chance. "Mama?" Tommy's voice came from the doorway, soft and uncertain. "Are you sad?" She looked up to find all three children watching her with concern. Even Samuel seemed to sense the weight of the moment, his small face serious as he approached on unsteady legs. "Not sad, sweetheart, just remembering." Tommy came closer, his eyes drawn to the photograph in her hands. "Is that Papa? My real Papa?" The question might have hurt once, but now Sadie heard it for what it was, not a rejection of Gideon, but a child's attempt to understand his place in a complex world. "Yes, that's your father. He loved you very much, even though he didn't get to see you grow up." Lucy climbed onto the bed beside her, studying the photograph with 5-year-old intensity. "He looks nice, like he would have been a good papa." He was. For the time we had together, he was wonderful. "But Mr. Gideon is good too," Tommy said carefully, as if testing dangerous waters. "Yes, he is. Very good. So it's okay to love them both, even though one is gone?" Out of the mouths of babes again, Tommy had cut straight to the heart of her struggle, with the wisdom that children sometimes possessed in greater measure than adults. "Yes, sweetheart. It's more than okay, it's right. Love doesn't diminish when we share it. If anything, it grows." Samuel toddled over and reached for the photograph, his small fingers gentle as he touched the glass. "Papa," he said clearly, though whether he meant Daniel or Gideon was unclear. Perhaps it didn't matter. Perhaps both men could hold that title in their own ways, as the father who had given the children life, the other as the father who would help them live it. "Are you going to keep it?" Lucy asked, still studying the faded image. "Yes, but I think I'm ready to put it somewhere visible again. Your father was part of our story, and he always will be, but our story isn't finished yet." That night, after the children were asleep, Sadie placed the photograph on the mantel in the parlor, next to the nativity scene that Gideon's father had carved with such loving care. Two families, two kinds of love, two chapters in the same continuing story. When Gideon found her there, he didn't comment on the photograph's presence or ask if its prominence meant she was having second thoughts. Instead, he simply took her hand and stood beside her, looking at the images of past and future with quiet acceptance. "He would have liked you," Sadie said softly. "I hope so. I like to think we would have been friends." It was such a generous thing to say, so free of jealousy or territorial feeling, that Sadie felt her heart expand another degree. This was what real love looked like, she realized. Not the desperate possession of youth, but the confident generosity of maturity, love that could honor the past while embracing the future. Outside, the wind picked up again, promising another storm on the horizon. But inside the warm parlor, surrounded by symbols of love both lost and found, Sadie felt nothing but peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, all of them, living and remembered, bound by the endless capacity of the human heart to love and love again. February arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made even the hardiest frontiersman respect winter's power. The thermometer outside the kitchen window regularly dropped below zero, and the wind carried an edge that could cut through the thickest coat like a blade. But inside the Thorne house, wedding preparations created a warmth that had nothing to do with the massive fireplaces. Sadie had agreed to an April wedding early enough to take advantage of spring's arrival, but late enough to allow for proper planning. Maria had thrown herself into the preparations with the enthusiasm of a woman who'd been waiting years to plan a celebration in the house she'd tended so carefully. Every spare moment was spent discussing flowers, menu options, and the complex logistics of hosting what would undoubtedly be the social event of the year in Hollow Trace. The children, meanwhile, were adjusting to their new reality with the resilience that seemed to be their particular gift. Tommy had begun referring to Gideon as Papa Gideon without being asked, a compromise that honored both his birth father and the man who was raising him. Lucy had appointed herself chief wedding advisor, offering opinions on everything from dress colors to cake flavors with the authority of someone who'd attended dozens of such events. Samuel, approaching his second birthday, simply accepted that Gideon belonged to them as naturally as he accepted that the sun rose in the east. It was during one of these peaceful domestic interludes that their carefully constructed world began to show cracks. Sadie was in the kitchen with Maria, working on preserving the last of the winter apples, when Jack Morrison burst through the back door with an expression that made both women freeze. "Where's Gideon?" he demanded without preamble. "In the barn with Tommy," Sadie replied, alarm rising in her chest. "Jack, what's wrong?" "Need to talk to him. Both of you. Now." The urgency in his voice brooked no argument. Sadie wiped her hands on her apron and followed him out into the bitter afternoon air, Maria close behind. They found Gideon teaching Tommy how to properly curry a horse, the boy's face intent with concentration as he worked the brush through the mare's coat. "Boss," Jack called, his voice tight. "We got a problem." Gideon looked up immediately, his experienced eye reading the distress in his foreman's expression. "Tommy, why don't you go help Maria finish those apples? We'll continue this lesson later." The boy nodded and headed toward the house, though Sadie could see his reluctance to leave what was clearly important adult business. Once he was out of earshot, Jack moved closer, his voice dropping to a level that wouldn't carry beyond their small circle. "I was in town this morning, picking up supplies, stopped by Murphy's for a drink, and I heard Blake and Marcus Dalton talking in the back room. Thought it was just the usual gossip until I heard your name." Gideon's expression darkened at the mention of Marcus Dalton, a neighboring rancher who'd been coveting Thorne land for years. Dalton owned the spread to the south smaller than Gideon's, but still substantial land. He'd made no secret of his belief that one man shouldn't control so much prime grazing territory. "What kind of talk?" Gideon asked. Jack glanced at Sadie, clearly uncomfortable. "Maybe we should discuss this privately." "She's going to be my wife," Gideon said firmly. "Whatever affects me affects her. Speak freely." Jack nodded reluctantly. "They're planning something. Been meeting regular, like for weeks apparently. Blake's been researching territorial law, looking for ways to challenge your ownership of the ranch." "On what grounds?" Sadie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Mental incompetence," Jack said bluntly. "They're claiming that taking in a homeless woman and her children, planning to marry someone you barely know, giving away portions of your estate, all of it proves you're not of sound mind." The words hit Sadie like a physical blow. She'd known there would be gossip, had prepared herself for social disapproval and whispered speculation. But this was an attack on everything they'd built together, everything they'd hoped to create. "That's ridiculous," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she could see how their story might look to outsiders. A wealthy man suddenly taking in strangers, planning to marry a woman he'd known for only a few months, immediately changing his will to provide for her children to those determined to find evidence of instability. It might indeed seem suspicious. "It gets worse," Jack continued grimly. "They've been collecting testimony from people in town. Mrs. Henderson's been talking about how you changed overnight, how you used to keep to yourself, but now you're acting like a different person entirely. Even some of the hands from other ranches have been questioned about your recent behavior." Gideon's hands clenched into fists. "What kind of testimony?" The kind that makes a grieving widower's kindness look like madness, Jack said. Blake's been real careful about how he phrases things, never saying outright that you're incompetent, just asking questions, wondering aloud if maybe your judgment's been affected by loneliness, suggesting that maybe someone's taking advantage of your grief. Sadie felt sick. Every act of kindness, every gesture of love, every step toward building a family, all of it, was being twisted into evidence of mental deficiency. And she was the supposed cause, the scheming woman who'd somehow manipulated a powerful man into losing his senses. "There's more," Jack said, his reluctance clear. "They've got legal papers, some kind of petition to have you declared incompetent to manage your affairs. If they can get enough signatures, they can force a hearing." "Who would sign such a thing?" Sadie asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. "More people than you'd think," Jack admitted. "Blake's got influence, and Dalton's been spreading money around. Plus, there's always been folks who resented your success, boss. This gives them a chance to cut you down to size while telling themselves they're doing it for your own good." Gideon was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes distant as he processed the information. When he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say. Could be weeks, could be months. Depends on how fast they can gather support and get the paperwork filed. But boss," Jack's voice carried a warning, "if they succeed, if a judge declares you incompetent, you'll lose everything. The ranch, your assets, your right to make your own decisions. They could even prevent the wedding." The implications hung in the air like a poison cloud. Everything they'd worked toward, everything they'd built, could be destroyed by legal maneuvering and small-town prejudice. Worse, Sadie knew that if Gideon lost his ranch because of his association with her, she'd never forgive herself. "Maybe I should leave," she said quietly, "if my presence is what's causing this." "No," Gideon's voice cut through her words like a knife. "You're not running, and I'm not letting them drive you away. We're going to fight this." "How?" she asked. "If they have testimony from half the town, then we'll get testimony from the other half. There are plenty of people who know me well enough to swear I'm as sane as I ever was. Jack, I'll need you to start reaching out to our allies. Reverend Matthews, Doc Morrison, the hands who've worked for me the longest. Anyone who can testify to my character and judgment." Jack nodded grimly. "I'll start tonight. But boss, we need to be smart about this. Blake and Dalton aren't just challenging your competence, they're attacking the whole idea of this marriage. If we're going to counter their narrative, we need to show that what you're doing isn't crazy but generous, noble even. What are you suggesting?" "Move the wedding up. Don't wait for April, do it now, while we still can. Show the whole territory that this isn't some impulsive decision, but a deliberate choice made by a man who knows his own mind." Sadie felt her heart race. The idea of rushing their wedding felt wrong somehow, as if they were being forced into something that should have been their choice alone. But she could see the tactical wisdom in Jack's suggestion. "It would send a message," Gideon agreed slowly. "Make it harder for them to claim I'm being manipulated if I marry you in front of the whole community. And it would protect you legally," Jack added. "Once you're married, your wife has certain rights that would be harder for them to challenge." The conversation continued for another hour, covering strategies and contingencies that made Sadie's head spin. But underneath all the tactical planning, one truth emerged clearly. Their quiet courtship was over. From now on, everything they did would be scrutinized, analyzed, and potentially used against them. That evening, after the children were in bed, Sadie and Gideon sat in the parlor discussing their options. The comfortable domesticity that had characterized their relationship for months now felt fragile, threatened by forces beyond their control. "Are you having second thoughts?" Gideon asked gently. "About any of this?" Sadie looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not the wealthy rancher or the powerful man others feared, but the patient teacher who'd helped Tommy learn to rope, the gentle storyteller who'd made Lucy laugh, the tender caregiver who'd rocked Samuel through countless nights. "No," she said firmly. "If anything, this makes me more certain. They want to tear us apart because they can't understand what we have. They think love has to fit their narrow definitions, follow their arbitrary rules. Well, they're wrong. Gideon smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since Jack's revelation. So we fight? We fight, and we win, because what we're building here is too important to let small minds and smaller hearts destroy. Outside, the wind howled around the house with renewed fury, as if nature itself were conspiring against them. But inside, surrounded by the warmth they'd created together, Sadie felt nothing but determination. They'd faced poverty, loss, and uncertainty together. Now they'd face legal challenges and social prejudice the same way as a family, united against whatever storm the world chose to send their way. The wedding would happen sooner than planned, but the love that inspired it was as real as the mountains that surrounded their valley. And love, Sadie had learned, was stronger than law, more enduring than gossip, and more powerful than all the forces that sought to diminish it. Let Blake and Dalton bring their papers and their purchase testimony. She and Gideon had something better truth, and the courage to defend it. The decision to move the wedding forward galvanized the household into action. What had been a leisurely months-long preparation became a whirlwind of activity as everyone worked to organize a ceremony worthy of the occasion while building a defense against the legal challenge that threatened to destroy everything they'd worked toward. Gideon's first move was to visit his lawyer in Cheyenne, a gruff but capable man named Harrison Webb, who specialized in territorial law and had handled the Thorne family's legal affairs for over a decade. The trip required 2 days of hard riding through weather that would have deterred a less determined man, but Gideon returned with both reassurance and sobering reality. Webb says we have a strong case. He reported to Sadie, and Jack nodded grimly, which means we need to control the narrative, make sure our version of events reaches people before Blake and Dalton's lies take root. It was during this conversation that Gideon revealed another aspect of his past that surprised even those who thought they knew him well. From a locked cabinet in his study, he withdrew a leather portfolio filled with official-looking documents and correspondence. "What are those?" Sadie asked, noting the military seals and government letterheads visible among the papers. "My service records," Gideon replied quietly, "and letters of commendation from officers I served under during the war between the states." The revelation that Gideon had military experience came as a shock to Sadie, though it explained much about his bearing and the easy authority he commanded. As he spread the documents across his desk, a picture emerged of a man who had not only served with distinction, but had been entrusted with significant responsibility at a young age. Lieutenant Colonel Gideon Thorne, Jack read from one of the commendations, his voice filled with newfound respect, commanded the 3rd Montana Cavalry Regiment during the final campaign in Virginia, cited for tactical brilliance and extraordinary leadership under fire. "You never mentioned this," Sadie said, studying a photograph of a much younger Gideon in Union blue, his face serious beneath a cavalry officer's hat. "It was a long time ago," Gideon replied simply, "and war isn't something I care to remember fondly. But these documents establish a pattern of sound judgment and mental competence that goes back over 15 years. Webb thinks they'll be valuable in court." The military records were indeed impressive, but what struck Sadie most was the insight they provided into Gideon's character. The official language of military commendations was dry, but between the lines she could read the story of a young man who had earned his fellow soldiers' trust through calm leadership and strategic thinking under the worst possible circumstances. "This changes things," Jack said thoughtfully. "A decorated war hero doesn't fit their narrative of a grief-addled rancher making impulsive decisions. We need to make sure everyone knows about your service record." Over the following days, their defense strategy took shape with the precision of a military campaign. Gideon's tactical training proved invaluable as he approached the challenge with the same methodical planning that had once served him on battlefields. Every ally was catalogued, every potential weakness identified, every advantage leveraged. Reverend Matthews proved an enthusiastic supporter, agreeing not only to perform the ceremony on short notice, but to publicly affirm Gideon's mental soundness from the pulpit. Doc Morrison, who had treated the Thorne family for years, provided a written statement attesting to Gideon's stable mental health. Even some of the more respectable businessmen in town, who had initially been neutral, began to express support when they learned of Blake's underhanded tactics. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Tommy, despite being only 8 years old, had overheard enough adult conversations to understand that people were saying bad things about Gideon. His response was to write a letter laboriously printed in his careful schoolboy hand to anyone who would listen. "Mr. Gideon is the best man I know," the letter began. "He teach me to ride horses and fix fences and be brave when I'm scared. He reads to us every night and never gets mad when Samuel spills things. He makes Mama smile again, and he promised we can stay forever. Anyone who says he's not smart doesn't know him like we do." The simple honesty of the child's words proved more persuasive than any legal argument. When word of the letter spread through town, it sparked a counter-narrative that Blake and Dalton found difficult to combat. How could a man who inspired such devotion from children be the calculating manipulator they claimed to see? Meanwhile, Maria had mobilized the informal network of household staff that connected the territory's major ranches. Her connections provided valuable intelligence about Blake and Dalton's activities, including the disturbing news that they had been offering financial incentives to encourage testimony against Gideon. "Mrs. Dalton's maid says they've been meeting every week," Maria reported during one of their evening strategy sessions. "Always at Blake's house, always late at night. And there's been strangers coming and going, men from Denver, maybe even from back east." The suggestion of outside involvement worried Gideon more than he let on. Local prejudice was one thing, but if Blake and Dalton had attracted support from larger interests, perhaps railroad companies or mining concerns, who coveted his strategically located ranch, the challenge would be far more serious than simple small-town politics. It was Jack who uncovered the most damaging piece of information. Through a combination of careful questioning and strategic drinking with loose-tongued ranch hands, he learned that Blake had been forging documents to support his case. Property records had been altered to suggest financial irregularities in Gideon's management, and correspondence had been fabricated to make his recent decisions appear more erratic than they actually were. "This is criminal," Sadi said when Jack reported his findings. "Surely when people learn they've been lying." "They'll claim the documents are legitimate and we're the ones lying," Gideon replied pragmatically. "We need proof of their deception, not just accusations." The proof came from an unexpected source. Late one night, as a February blizzard raged outside, there came a soft knock at the kitchen door. Maria answered to find a shivering figure bundled in a heavy coat. Blake's clerk, a nervous young man named Peter Hendricks who worked in the bank's back office. "I need to speak to Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About Mr. Blake and the documents." What Hendricks revealed over a cup of hot coffee nearly changed everything. As Blake's clerk, he had been forced to participate in the document forgery, creating false records and backdating correspondence under threat of dismissal. His conscience had finally overwhelmed his fear, especially after learning that children might suffer if Blake's scheme succeeded. "I kept copies," he said, producing a leather satchel filled with papers. "The real documents and the fake ones. I thought someday it might matter." The evidence was damning. Original property records showed Gideon's exemplary financial management, while the forged versions suggested irregularities that had never occurred. Correspondence in Blake's handwriting was revealed to be fabricated, designed to create a false narrative of mental decline. "This proves they've been lying," Sadi said, hope rising in her voice. "It proves Blake's been committing fraud," Gideon corrected. "But we need to be careful how we use this information. Hendricks took a serious risk bringing this to us, and we can't expose him unless we're certain we can protect him." The final piece of their defense strategy involved the wedding itself. Rather than a small, private ceremony, they decided to make it a public celebration that would demonstrate community support while symbolically affirming Gideon's mental competence. The guest list grew to include every ally they could count on, plus several neutral parties whose attendance would signal broader acceptance. Lucy threw herself into wedding preparations with 5-year-old determination, appointed herself flower girl and chief advisor on all matters of decoration. Tommy, meanwhile, took his role as ring-bearer with the seriousness of a military mission, practicing his walk down the aisle with the precision his papa Gideon had taught him. Samuel, approaching his 2nd birthday, was simply excited by all the activity. His vocabulary had expanded dramatically during their months at the ranch, and he delighted everyone by referring to the upcoming event as Mama and Giddy's party. The dress presented its own challenges. Catherine's wedding gown had been preserved carefully, but it required significant alterations to fit Sadie's smaller frame. Maria worked tirelessly with needle and thread, adjusting the elegant silk and lace creation to honor both the woman who had worn it first and the woman who would wear it now. She would have wanted this, Maria said as she made the final adjustments. Senora Catherine, she would have wanted her dress to see happiness again. As the wedding date approached, now set for the 2nd Sunday, and much tension in the household grew. Blake and Dalton's legal challenge was moving forward, with rumors suggesting they planned to present their petition to the territorial judge immediately after the ceremony. The timing was clearly intended to maximize embarrassment and suggest that even Gideon's marriage was evidence of his impaired judgment. But Gideon's military training had taught him that the best defense was often a good offense. On the Friday before the wedding, he made a surprising announcement. "We're going to confront them directly," he told the assembled household. "Tomorrow morning, I'm calling a town meeting. We're going to present our evidence publicly and force them to defend their accusations in front of everyone." It was a risky strategy that could backfire spectacularly if the townspeople sided with Blake and Dalton. But it also offered the possibility of ending the threat once and for all, allowing them to marry without the shadow of legal challenges hanging over their future. "Are you sure about this?" Sadie asked that evening as they reviewed their plans one final time. If it goes wrong, we'll face the consequences together," Gideon replied. "But I'd rather fight this battle on our terms than wait for them to choose the battlefield." Outside, the March wind carried the promise of spring, though snow still covered the ground and ice glazed the windows. Inside the house that had become their sanctuary, a family prepared for the fight of their lives, not just for their right to be together, but for their right to define what family meant on their own terms. The children were asleep, dreaming of wedding cake and new beginnings. Maria was putting finishing touches on Sadie's dress, her fingers gentle as she worked with fabric that had witnessed one love story and would soon bless another. And in the study, surrounded by military commendations and legal documents, Gideon planned his final campaign not against an enemy army, but against prejudice, greed, and the small minds that couldn't comprehend the transformative power of love freely given and gratefully received. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation they'd been preparing for. But tonight, they were still just a family, bound together by choice and strengthened by the challenges they'd already overcome. Whatever happened next, they would face it as they'd faced everything else together during a strategy session in his study. The burden of proof for declaring someone mentally incompetent is high, and my business records show consistent, profitable decision-making over many years. But he also warned that public opinion can influence judges, especially in territorial courts where politics matter as much as law. The morning of the town meeting dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made every sound carry farther than it should. By 10 o'clock, the church was fuller than it had been since Christmas, packed with ranchers, townspeople, and curious onlookers who had come to witness what everyone knew would be either vindication or destruction for one of the territory's most prominent families. Sadie sat in the front pew with the children, her hands folded carefully to hide their trembling. She had dressed with particular care, choosing Catherine's navy blue dress altered by Maria to fit perfectly and arranging her hair in a style that spoke of respectability and quiet dignity. Beside her, Tommy sat with military straightness, unconsciously mimicking the bearing he'd observed in Gideon. Lucy held tight to her hand, while Samuel dozed peacefully in her lap, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding around him. At the front of the church, Reverend Matthews had yielded the pulpit to serve as neutral moderator, though his sympathies were clearly with Gideon. The church's sacred space lent gravity to the proceedings, its stained glass windows casting colored light across faces both friendly and hostile. Blake and Dalton sat across the aisle, with their supporters a collection of men whose motivations ranged from genuine concern to simple resentment of Gideon's success. Blake wore his finest suit and carried a leather portfolio that undoubtedly contained the forged documents they intended to present as evidence. Dalton, never as smooth as his partner, fidgeted with obvious nervousness, his eyes darting frequently toward the exits as if already planning his retreat. When Gideon rose to address the assembly, the church fell silent. He had chosen to wear his best civilian clothes rather than his old uniform, but his bearing still carried the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to command. In his hands, he held the leather portfolio containing his military service records, ultimate proof of competence and character. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the packed church. "I've called this meeting because lies have been spread about my character and my judgment. Rather than let gossip and innuendo poison this community, I prefer to address these accusations directly and publicly." A murmur ran through the assembly. This was not how such disputes were usually handled in Hollow Trace, where conflicts were more often resolved through intermediaries or simply allowed to fester in shadows. "Mr. Blake and Mr. Dalton have suggested that my recent actions offering shelter to Mrs. Mercer and her children, planning to marry her, and providing for their future indicate mental incompetence. They claim these decisions are evidence of impaired judgment brought on by grief or manipulation." Blake half rose from his seat. "Now see here, Thorne, that's not exactly—" "Let me finish," Gideon said quietly, but with such authority that Blake immediately subsided. "They have gathered testimony from various sources to support their claim that I am no longer capable of managing my own affairs. What they haven't told you is that some of this testimony is based on fabricated evidence." The murmur grew louder, and several people turned to stare at Blake, whose face had gone red with anger or embarrassment. "That's a serious accusation," Reverend Matthews said carefully. "Do you have proof?" In response, Gideon opened his portfolio and withdrew Peter Hendrick's carefully preserved documents. "I have original bank records showing my financial management over the past 5 years, alongside altered versions that Mr. Blake has been circulating to suggest irregularities that never occurred. I have genuine correspondence compared to fabricated letters designed to make my decisions appear erratic." Blake shot to his feet, his composure finally cracking. "Those documents were stolen from my office. This is theft, plain and simple." "No," came a quiet voice from the back of the church. Peter Hendrick stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "I preserved them because I knew what you were doing was wrong. You forced me to help create false evidence, Mr. Blake. You told me it was necessary to protect Mr. Thorne from his own poor judgment, but I knew it was really about money and land, and your jealousy of his success." The young clerk's testimony hit the assembly like a thunderclap. Here was someone with intimate knowledge of Blake's activities, confirming what many had suspected, but none had been willing to voice. "You're lying," Dalton shouted, rising to stand beside Blake. "This is all fabricated to cover up the truth that Thorne's lost his mind and is being manipulated by that woman." The insult to Sadi sparked immediate response from the church. Several men rose from their seats, their faces dark with anger at the slur against a woman who couldn't defend herself in such a setting. But before anyone else could speak, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Dalton," Tommy said, standing up in the front pew with 8-year-old dignity, "you're wrong about my mama, and you're wrong about Papa Gideon." The child's clear voice carried perfectly in the silent church. Every head turned toward him as he continued with the fearless honesty that only children possess. "Papa Gideon isn't crazy. He's the smartest man I know. He taught me about horses and cattle and how to be honest even when it's hard. He reads to us every night, and he never gets mad when we make mistakes. And my Mamaché's not trying to trick anybody. She works harder than anyone, and she makes sure we mind our manners, and she cries sometimes when she thinks we're not looking because she misses my real papa, but she's happy too because Papa Gideon takes care of us. The simple sincerity of the boy's words carried more weight than any legal argument. Several women in the congregation were openly weeping, and even some of the men who had come prepared to support Blake and Dalton looked uncomfortable with the accusations against a family that included such obviously well-cared-for children. But Blake wasn't finished. Desperation made him reckless as he saw his carefully constructed case crumbling around him. "The boy's been coached," he declared. "Children can be taught to say anything. The fact remains that Gideon Thorne has undergone a complete personality change. The man who was once the most independent rancher in the territory is now dancing to the tune of a woman who appeared out of nowhere with a convenient sob story and 3 hungry children." "Is that what you think happened?" Gideon asked, his voice deadly quiet. "That Mrs. Mercer somehow orchestrated our meeting, that she arranged to be found destitute and desperate so she could manipulate me into helping her?" "I think opportunists come in many forms," Blake replied, regaining some of his confidence, "and I think grief can make even strong men vulnerable to exploitation." It was then that Gideon played his final card. From his portfolio, he withdrew his military service records, spreading them across the makeshift table that had been set up near the pulpit. "You speak of personality changes and impaired judgment," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "Let me tell you about judgment under pressure. These documents show my service record during the war between the states. For 4 years, I commanded men in combat situations where a single poor decision meant death for soldiers under my command." He held up one of the commendations, its official seal clearly visible. "This citation is for the Battle of Cedar Creek, where my regiment held a crucial position against overwhelming odds, because I made the tactical decision to sacrifice our horses to create defensive barriers. 60 men lived because I had the judgment to see beyond conventional thinking." Another document joined the first. "This one is for the campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, where I successfully evacuated 300 wounded soldiers by identifying a river crossing that everyone else said was impossible. Poor judgment, Mr. Blake, or the ability to see solutions that others miss." The military records painted a picture of a man whose judgment had been tested under the ultimate pressure and found reliable. It was becoming clear that Blake's characterization of Gideon as mentally unstable was not just wrong but insulting to his distinguished service record. "The same judgment that served me in war," Gideon continued, "told me that a woman in desperate circumstances deserved help, that children needed protection, and that my empty house could become a home again. If that's madness, then I'm proud to be mad." Dr. Morrison stood up from his seat near the middle of the church. As the territory's most respected physician, his opinion carried enormous weight. "I've been Gideon Thorne's doctor for over 10 years, he announced. "I attended his wife during her final illness and have seen him through the worst grief a man can endure. I can state categorically that he shows no signs of mental impairment. If anything, his recent actions demonstrate remarkable emotional recovery and sound practical judgment." Other voices began to join in ranch hands who testified to Gideon's continued competence in business matters, neighbors who had observed his interactions with the children, townspeople who had witnessed Sadi's transformation from desperate widow to confident woman. The narrative Blake and Dalton had tried to construct was crumbling under the weight of truth and community support. But the decisive moment came when Reverend Matthews himself spoke from his position as moderator. "I've known Gideon Thorne since he was a young man," the minister said, his voice carrying the moral authority of his calling. "I married him to his first wife. I buried her and their infant son, and I've watched him struggle with grief that would have broken lesser men. What I see now is not madness but healing, not exploitation, but love freely given and gratefully received." The Reverend's gaze swept the assembly, touching each face with pastoral authority. "The Bible tells us that pure religion is to care for orphans and widows in their distress. Thorne has done exactly that. If we condemn him for Christian charity and call love madness, then we condemn ourselves." A final murmur ran through the church, but this time it was the sound of a community reaching consensus. Blake and Dalton's support was visibly evaporating as people who had come prepared to question Gideon's judgment instead found themselves questioning the motives of his accusers. The tide had turned decisively against Blake and Dalton, but desperation made them dangerous. As the assembly began to stir with obvious sympathy for Gideon's position, Blake made one final, desperate gambit. "Fine words and emotional appeals," he said, his voice carrying across the church with the polished authority of a man accustomed to swaying opinion through rhetoric. "But they don't change the fundamental question. Can any of you honestly say that the Gideon Thorne you know would have acted this way a year ago? Can any of you claim that taking in strangers and immediately planning marriage shows the same careful judgment he once displayed?" The question struck home because it contained a grain of truth. The old Gideon had been solitary, careful, slow to trust. The transformation was real and dramatic, even if the motivations were pure. But before anyone could respond to Blake's challenge, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. Sadie rose slowly from her seat, her face pale but determined. "May I speak?" she asked Reverend Matthews. The minister nodded, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. A woman addressing a mixed assembly was highly irregular, but these were irregular circumstances. Sadie moved to stand beside Gideon, her chin raised with quiet dignity. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the packed church. "Mr. Blake asks if this is the same man you've always known," she began. "And he's right, it isn't. The man who found me behind Murphy's barn was broken by grief, living alone in a house that had become a tomb. He was barely existing, not truly living." Several people nodded, remembering Gideon's isolation following Catherine's death. But that broken man still had enough compassion to help strangers in need. He saw children who were hungry and cold, and he acted without thought of reward or recognition. "That doesn't sound like madness. To me it sounds like greatness." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "Yes, he's changed. Love changes people. It opens hearts that have been closed, brings life to places that have known only sorrow. My children didn't manipulate him, they reminded him that joy was still possible. I didn't scheme to trap him, I simply showed him that his capacity for love hadn't died with his wife." Blake tried to interrupt, but Sadie's clear voice overrode his protest. "You want to know about judgment? Let me tell you about real judgment. When my husband died and left us with nothing, I had to make choices no woman should face. I could have sent my children to the orphanage and tried to start over alone. I could have accepted charity that came with shameful strings attached. I could have given up entirely." Tears glistened in her eyes, but her voice remained strong. "Instead, I chose to fight for my family's survival, even when it meant hiding behind buildings and hoping no one would notice us. I chose to accept help from a man who offered it freely, even when my pride screamed against it, and I chose to love again, even knowing it meant risking my heart." She turned to face Blake directly, her gaze unwavering. "You speak of manipulation and exploitation, but I ask you, who has gained more from this arrangement? The desperate widow who found shelter and security, or the grieving widower who found purpose and family? Who has been transformed more, the woman who learned to hope again, or the man who remembered how to love?" The question hung in the air, its implications clear to everyone present. If anyone had been changed for the better by their unconventional arrangement, it was clearly Gideon. "As for your concerns about his judgment," Sadie continued, "let me tell you what I've observed during our months together. He runs his ranch with the same efficiency he always has. His business decisions remain sound and profitable. His treatment of his workers is fair and generous. The only thing that's changed is that he's no longer alone." She paused, gathering herself for her final argument. "Mr. Blake, you and Mr. Dalton claim to be concerned about Gideon's welfare. But if that were true, wouldn't you be celebrating his recovery instead of trying to destroy it? Wouldn't you be happy to see him thriving instead of plotting to take away everything that brings him joy?" The accusation hit home. Several people in the assembly began to murmur among themselves, and it was clear that Blake and Dalton's motivations were finally being questioned openly. But Sadi wasn't finished. "There's something else you should know. Tomorrow, Gideon and I are to be married in this church. We had planned a small ceremony, but given the circumstances, I invite everyone here to attend. Come and see for yourselves whether this is the desperate act of a manipulated man or the joyful choice of two people who have found love against all odds." The invitation was brilliant in its simplicity. By opening their wedding to public scrutiny, she was challenging anyone who doubted their sincerity to witness the truth for themselves. Gideon stepped forward to stand beside her, his hand finding hers in a gesture that spoke of partnership and mutual support. "What my future wife says is true. Our wedding will be tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and all are welcome. Judge for yourselves whether this is madness or simply two broken people helping each other heal." Reverend Matthews rose from his seat, his face bright with obvious approval. "In that case, let me share some good news with this assembly. It will be my great honor to perform the ceremony that unites Mr. Thorne and Mrs. Mercer in marriage. I can think of no better response to these unfounded accusations than a celebration of love and commitment." The minister reached into his vest pocket and withdrew an official-looking document. "In fact, I have here the marriage certificate template, properly prepared and witnessed. If Mr. Thorne and Mrs. Mercer are willing, we could formalize their engagement right now, before this entire assembly." The suggestion caught everyone by surprise, including Gideon and Sadi. But the tactical brilliance of the move was immediately apparent. Public engagement would make it nearly impossible for Blake and Dalton to continue their legal challenge. "What do you say?" Gideon asked Sadi quietly. "Are you willing to make this official in front of everyone?" Sadi looked out at the assembly at the faces that had been hostile an hour ago, but now showed growing sympathy and support. She saw Maria beaming from the back of the church, Jack Morrison nodding encouragement, and dozens of neighbors who had come to witness a controversy, but were instead being invited to celebrate a love story. "Yes," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. "I am." What followed was unprecedented in Hollow Trace's history. Reverend Matthews called for witnesses as he produced the engagement documents, and person after person came forward to sign their names in support of the union. Dr. Morrison signed first, followed by several prominent ranchers who had worked with Gideon for years. Even some who had initially been neutral or skeptical found themselves caught up in the moment's emotional power. As the signing continued, Blake and Dalton found themselves increasingly isolated. Their supporters had melted away, unwilling to continue opposing what had clearly become a community celebration. Finally, Blake himself stood to address the assembly one last time. "This is all very touching," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "But legal documents and public sentiment don't change the facts. I still believe—" "Mr. Blake," interrupted a voice from the back of the church. "I think you've said quite enough." All heads turned to see Harrison Webb, Gideon's lawyer from Cheyenne, standing in the doorway. The distinguished attorney had ridden hard through the night to arrive in time for the confrontation, and his presence immediately shifted the dynamic in the room. "Mr. Webb," Gideon said with obvious relief, "I wasn't expecting you. When I received word of these proceedings, I felt I should be here to represent your interests," Webb replied, moving forward through the assembly. "Especially since I have some information that might interest Mr. Blake and Mr. Dalton." He reached into his coat and withdrew a thick folder. "You see, gentlemen, when you filed your preliminary petition questioning Mr. Thorne's competence, it triggered certain legal procedures. One of those procedures was an investigation into the evidence supporting your claims." Blake's face went pale as Webb continued. "That investigation has revealed substantial fraud in the documents you submitted. Forged bank records, fabricated correspondence, altered property deeds, intended to create a false narrative about my client's mental state." The lawyer's gaze swept the assembly before returning to Blake and Dalton. "Such fraud is a serious crime under territorial law, punishable by significant fines and imprisonment. However, I'm authorized to offer you a choice. You can withdraw your petition immediately and leave Mr. Thorne and his family in peace, or you can face criminal prosecution for fraud and conspiracy. The threat was delivered with the calm authority of a man who held all the cards. Blake and Dalton exchanged glances, both clearly recognizing that their scheme had not only failed, but had exposed them to serious legal consequences. "This is preposterous," Dalton blustered, but his heart wasn't in it. "You can't prove." "Actually, we can," Webb interrupted smoothly. "Mr. Hendricks has provided extensive testimony about your activities, including detailed knowledge of how the false documents were created. Combined with the physical evidence and witness statements, we have more than enough to secure convictions." The silence that followed was profound. Blake and Dalton had gambled everything on their ability to destroy Gideon's reputation and claim his land. Instead, they had destroyed their own credibility and exposed themselves to criminal prosecution. Finally, Blake spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We withdraw the petition." "Excellent," Webb replied. "I'll file the appropriate paperwork this afternoon. And gentlemen, I suggest you consider this matter permanently closed." As Blake and Dalton slunk toward the exit, followed by their few remaining supporters, the rest of the assembly burst into spontaneous applause. The threat that had hung over Gideon and Sadie's future had been decisively eliminated, clearing the way for tomorrow's wedding celebration. But the real victory wasn't legal, it was personal. By standing together before their community and defending their right to love, Gideon and Sadie had proven that their bond was strong enough to weather any storm. They had faced down prejudice, greed, and legal challenge, and they had emerged stronger for the experience. As the church began to empty, people approached to offer congratulations and confirm their attendance at tomorrow's ceremony. What had begun as a confrontation had become an engagement party, complete with community blessing and legal protection. Tommy tugged at Gideon's coat, his young face bright with excitement. "Papa, Gideon, does this mean they can't make us leave?" "No one can make us leave," Gideon confirmed, lifting the boy so they were eye to eye. "We're family now, officially and permanently." "Forever?" Lucy asked, joining them with Samuel in her arms. "Forever," Sadie confirmed, her heart full to bursting with love and relief and anticipation for the future they would build together. Outside, spring was beginning to touch the mountain air with warmth and promise. But inside the church, where they would be married tomorrow, a family that had been forged by necessity and strengthened by love had just won the right to exist on their own terms, free from those who would diminish or destroy what they had built together. 6 months after the wedding that had become the talk of 3 counties, autumn painted the Thorne Ranch in shades of gold and crimson that took Sadie's breath away every morning when she stepped onto the porch with her coffee. The changing seasons had brought their own rhythm to the family's life, and she marveled at how naturally they had all settled into their roles. The kitchen window framed a scene that never failed to warm her heart. Tommy working alongside the ranch hands as they prepared the cattle for winter, his 10-year-old frame still small but his confidence unmistakable. He wore a hat identical to Gideon's and carried himself with the same quiet authority, earning the respect of men 3 times his age through sheer determination and an eagerness to learn. Lucy had claimed the vegetable garden as her special domain, and her careful tending had produced a harvest that impressed even Maria. At 7, she could identify every plant by sight and had developed an uncanny ability to predict which vegetables would thrive and which needed extra attention. Samuel, now a sturdy 2-year-old, followed her everywhere, his chubby hands helping to gather vegetables that often ended up in his mouth rather than the basket. The painted portrait that dominated the mantel in the parlor captured them all in that golden October lighter family portrait that had been Gideon's surprise for Sadie on their 6-month anniversary. The artist had traveled from Denver specifically to paint the Thorne family, and his skilled brush had caught not just their likenesses but something deeper. Tommy stood beside Gideon with a hand on his stepfather's shoulder, while Lucy sat at Sadie's feet with Samuel on her lap. but it was the expressions the artist had captured that made the portrait special, the contentment, the belonging, the simple joy of people who had found their place in the world. "Makes us look like we've been a family forever," Tommy had observed when the portrait was unveiled, and Sadie had realized he was right. The formal arrangement couldn't hide the natural affection that connected them all, the way they unconsciously leaned toward each other, the shared smiles that spoke of countless private moments and inside jokes. The legal challenges that had once threatened to tear them apart had been resolved decisively. Blake had not only withdrawn his petition but had quietly left Hollow Trace entirely, his reputation in ruins after the revelation of his fraudulent schemes. Dalton, faced with the loss of his most powerful ally and mounting debts from his failed land grab attempt, had been forced to sell portions of his ranch to remain solvent. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Gideon had purchased those same parcels at fair market value, extending his holdings while helping a former enemy avoid complete financial ruin. "Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well," Gideon had observed when the transaction was complete, and Sadie had fallen in love with him a little more for his gracious refusal to gloat over his enemy's misfortune. The ranch itself had prospered under their joint management. Sadie's practical experience, with stretching resources and making do, had complemented Gideon's business acumen perfectly, resulting in innovations that increased both efficiency and profits. Her suggestion to diversify into chicken farming had proven particularly successful, with Lucy's careful attention to the flock producing both eggs and meat that commanded premium prices in Denver markets. More importantly, the house had truly become a home. The rooms that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with children's laughter, dinner conversations, and the comfortable sounds of a family going about their daily business. Maria had embraced her role as unofficial grandmother to the children, teaching Lucy to cook traditional Mexican dishes while sharing stories of her own childhood that enchanted all three young ones. The transformation extended beyond their immediate household. Word of their successful defense against Blake and Dalton's accusations had spread throughout the territory, inspiring other unconventional families and earning respect from quarters that had initially been skeptical. Gideon's reputation had not only recovered, but had been enhanced by his willingness to stand up for his principles and defend those he loved. On this particular autumn evening, as Sadie watched Tommy help bring the cattle in from the far pasture, she reflected on how much had changed since that desperate October day when they'd hidden behind Murphy's barn. The empty biscuit tin that had symbolized their desperation now sat on a shelf in the pantry not as a reminder of hardship, but as a token of how far they'd come. Gideon had suggested they throw it away, but Sadie had insisted on keeping it. "It's part of our story," she'd explained. "The children should remember where we came from, even as they grow up with plenty." The wisdom of that decision had been proven recently when a family much like theirs had appeared in Hollow Trace, a widowed father with two young daughters, struggling to make ends meet after losing his homestead to drought. Without hesitation, Tommy had approached Gideon about offering help, citing the example his parents had set. "Remember when we didn't have anywhere to go?" he'd asked seriously. "Maybe we could help them like you helped us." The result had been a job offer for the man and temporary housing in one of the ranch's outbuildings while he got back on his feet. The two little girls, initially shy and frightened, had been gradually drawn into the extended family that seemed to expand naturally around the Thorne ranch. "We're starting a tradition," Gideon had told Sadie as they watched Lucy patiently teach the younger girl how to gather eggs, teaching the children that with good fortune comes responsibility. The evening routine had evolved into something sacred for their family. After supper, they would gather in the parlor, while Gideon read aloud from whatever book had captured the children's attention that week. Currently, they were working through Treasure Island, with Tommy hanging on every word of Jim Hawkins' adventures, while Lucy created elaborate drawings of pirates and ships. Samuel, though too young to follow the plot, loved the dramatic voices Gideon created for different characters. Tonight, as autumn wind rattled the windows and the first frost warnings had been posted, the reading was interrupted by a knock at the door. Jack Morrison entered, stamping his boots and pulling off his hat as he joined them by the fire. "Sorry to interrupt," he said with a grin that suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "But I thought you'd want to know. Got word from town that the territorial governor himself is planning to visit Hollow Trace next month. Wants to meet the family that's become famous for exemplifying frontier values and Christian charity." Sadie felt heat rise in her cheeks at the formal recognition, but Gideon merely chuckled. "Politicians," he said with gentle mockery, "always looking for good stories to tell." "Maybe so," Jack replied, "but the story's a good one. Wealthy rancher finds homeless family, provides shelter, faces down legal challenges to marry the woman and adopt her children. Sounds like something out of a dime novel, except it's real, and it happened right here. Don't forget the part where the family helps the rancher remember how to live again," Sadie added quietly. "That's the most important part of the story." As Jack left and the children were tucked into their beds, Sadie and Gideon found themselves alone in the parlor for their customary end-of-day conversation. These quiet moments had become precious to them, time to share the day's small victories and concerns, to plan for tomorrow, and simply to enjoy each other's company. "Do you ever regret it?" Gideon asked, a question that had become something of a ritual between them. "Giving up your independence to marry a stubborn rancher?" "Every day," Sadie replied with mock seriousness, "especially when that stubborn rancher leaves his boots in the middle of the kitchen floor." Then her expression softened. "Do you regret taking in a desperate woman and her troublesome children?" "Only when those troublesome children beat me at checkers," Gideon replied, pulling her close, "which is happening with alarming frequency." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire dance in the massive stone hearth while snow began to fall outside the windows. The first real snow of the season, promising months of winter that would test both livestock and humans, but that held no fear for a family prepared to face whatever came together. "I've been thinking," Sadie said eventually, "about that day behind the barn, about how terrified I was when you found us. You hid it well. I thought you were remarkably brave." "I wasn't brave at all. I was desperate and frightened and ready to run at the first sign of danger. But you," she paused, searching for the right words. "You saw something in us that we couldn't see in ourselves. You saw a family when all I could see were broken pieces." Gideon was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her. "Maybe that's what love does," he said finally. "It sees potential where others see problems. It finds hope in the most unlikely places." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the ranch in pristine white that would soon be marked by the tracks of cattle, horses, and children at play. But inside their warm home, surrounded by the evidence of lives well lived and love freely given, the Thorne family was complete. The empty biscuit tin in the pantry would remain there always, a reminder of how far they'd traveled from that desperate day. But the family portrait on the mantel told the real story, not of charity given and received, but of hearts opened and lives transformed by the simple recognition that love multiplies when shared. That families are built not just through blood but through choice, and that sometimes the richest man in town isn't the one with the most land, but the one who knows a treasure when it climbs into his wagon, cold and afraid, and decides to stay. In years to come, the story would indeed be told and retold throughout the territory, the tale of Gideon Thorne, who found more than he gave when he offered 4 simple words to a desperate woman. "Get in my wagon now." But those who lived it knew the deeper truth, that the real miracle hadn't been the rescue itself, but the family that had grown from that single act of kindness, proving that real love, was always stronger than fear, more powerful than prejudice, and more lasting than any challenge the world could send their way.